good to be with you. I just want to do a bit of review so I can make sure that we know who was where when, because I know, Carol, you were here yesterday.
Yes.
Anybody else here yesterday? Okay, so you don't get demerits for that. This was really designed to be reasonably each time self-contained. So what I would like to do is not a total review of everything we did yesterday, because that's redundant for someone as expert as you, especially. No, you.
She made come back.
So what I would like to do is to incorporate some of the ideas of what we spoke yesterday into a kind of moving forward, if you will, of the concerns and the issues and the ideas behind this very vivid and wonderful new book. We'll make note of one thing at the outset, which is the great care that went into its production. It was a work of love, and we noted yesterday as well that it was 12 years in the making. And it not only was 12 years in the making, it was 12 years of working as a committee in the making, which somehow everybody seemed to have survived, which is good. And the discussions and the approach to the entirety of this that was in process, I think, was representative. I think all of us would have liked to have been a fly on the wall to listen in on some of the changes and the kinds of internal dynamics, both within the conservative movement and the North American Jewish community as a whole. It is of a kind, in some respects, of other publications within the movement, including what is taking place within Israel. Of late, a new Israeli Kippur entirely in Hebrew for Israelis has been produced by our movement. But what it has done is it has incorporated some of the same themes as this has. Okay? So one of the ways in which one could look at this, and we did not talk about this yesterday, is that if you were to look at a prayer book produced in 1946, 1972, and 2008, 9, 10, 11, 12, you will see some very, very different things. I don't know if any of you happen to be here, but it's almost very parallel to what took place when we had Noam Sion visiting, and he described the differences in Haggadot, right? Whereas the Haggadah of the pre-war generation may have been entirely in Hebrew, and then we had that universally acclaimed beacon of Jewish production and death called the Mahzor Lev Shalem, followed by many others that came into play that not only reflected various social mores and values and environments, but also became art pieces in themselves. And I can't emphasize enough the historic and, I think, personal significance of something that is very simply called commentary. Okay. How many of you grew up or had some experience with the old Silverman Siddur? True and certain it is that there is one God and there is no other. Right? Tashkivenu. Okay, we all, the zeal renewed and strength restored, we will face the next day. It was of a piece of the time. Okay, what characterized it? By the way, if anyone knows that book well, it ought to be somebody from the greater Hartford area, right? Since it was produced here. But what characterized that book, if you recall?
A lot of English.
There's quite a bit of English.
A lot of transliteration.
Not very much, actually. If you look at it, there was some, but not a lot. Okay?
Explanations. I don't remember if they explained the prayers.
Very, very few.
I thought it was
Very few.
A lot of what I call Old English, words like thou.
Thou and thine. Okay. That would have been, how about with respect to gender? Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. And if you were to have extended that into the Silverman Mahzor for holidays, there were not only passages there that were filled with vines and bees and men and that, but also they produced a tremendous amount of material, and then the English translation was a very, very tiny little bit. Very tiny. Welcome.
Sorry, we're late.
That's okay, come on. Grab a book and come on forward. And there were also great pains taken to try to parallel, in some measure, the Hebrew. So if there was an acrostic in Hebrew, the Aleph Bet that formed the beginning of each stanza, they tried to do it very frequently in the English, which was very interesting, but it didn't always work as a direct translation. And you got some very interesting phrases extolling like captains of industry, right? Which you didn't see because there was no bailout of General Motors at the time, but there is now. As well as phrases like mellifluous orators of yore seem dying phrases. I'm not even sure what that means, but I have some sense, but it was probably something that never felt trippingly off the tongue, but it was of a time and a piece that was quite similar across the board. Okay? So part of it, I think, had to do with the sense of, here is a great text, we'll try to make it accessible to you on some levels, but the mystery is a big part of the appeal. Okay? And that went hand in hand with a tremendous number of choral pieces and cantorial solos and everything else that were a part of the tradition since the 19th century, if not before then, and has carried forward, but in different ways, radically different ways. What is unique about this book, in some respects, though not only to this book, obviously, is that on every single page virtually, there's commentary.
That's great.
There's commentary of different kinds. We're going to take a look at it. And this is not the innovation of the conservatives. As a matter of fact, I don't think it's even the innovation of the reform movement, where you might have perhaps expected that's where you would have begun. It was actually the innovation largely in two other places. One was the Chavurah/renewal movement, which is not really denominational at all, but was seeking to try to create a very spirited, a very spontaneous set of prayer experiences for those who attend those programs and services, and wanted to give people additional material to help in that regard. It was not necessarily explanatory. This is what this text meant, this is what was written, and so forth. Okay? And then much more so within Orthodoxy. The explosion of the Art Scroll program made its headway in large measure because it really wanted to take seriously the process of explanation and provided a very specific kind of explanation that was filled with Jewish legal halachic details, very basic but respectful ideas. This is how you do this, walking the worshiper hand in hand through every step of the way. This is why this takes place. This is why we repeat a line of Hallel whenever Hallel is recited, even though that seems unusual. And this is how you take steps back for the Amidah and so forth. And that has become, I think, the source of its popularity. And our movement has come to that of late as well. So this is the product of some very interesting developments. And the question, of course, is why? Well, let's take a pause, because I don't think everybody knows each other here. And that's not good. So, Annette, we'll start with you and we'll go on.
Annette Gavins.
Roberta Bueland.
Linda Steger. Andrea Lindenberg. Judy Levy.
Sidra Sperl.
Marvin Sterling.
Carol Johnson.
Okay. Jim Rosen. And we're all here to, I hope, deepen our experience of the holidays and as well. So what I think the writers here sought to do is to recognize a couple of things. It wanted to have an awareness of the average person that we would find, knowing that there's no average, of course, but that we would find in our seats. And a profile of the American Jew that I think underlies this book, well, if you've ever had the opportunity to page through it, what would you say? Who are they pitching this to? Those of you who've had a chance to look at it. Who is the intended reader, if you will? All of us.
I'd say the less formal person.
In what sense?
Someone that needs more everyday language. Some of the stiffness, perhaps, more friendly.
Okay. language, the whole idea of translation in language is of a certain kind. No these and thous. Right? How is God referred to?
Well, I haven't read it, but,
So, for example, turn to page 79. This is more or less arbitrary, but it's a reasonably good example. And in this page, this, by the way, is all of every little detail is sweated here. From the cover, which I mentioned yesterday, is the color was chosen, the texture was chosen. It's meant to have kind of a warm, luxurious texture. And because, as Ed Feldichter noted, it's 60% recycled material, it's the first green Mahzor, even though it's brown. But look at the second paragraph in the English, in 79. And how do we refer to you? It's the first. It's Adonai. Okay. So if we're going to translate that, what would it have been if it were not that? What is the original Hebrew? The original Hebrew is, strikingly enough, the four-letter name of God, which is usually spelled. Okay, that's the four-letter name of God, which, by the way, if you try to pronounce, gives you a lot of breath. And that's, I think, on purpose. We have to put vowels into it, but do you hear people pronouncing this in any particular way? Why not? Why don't we hear this pronounced in a kind of informal way all the time?
Traditionally, we were not expected to pronounce the reverent, the most reverent name of God, which is what we spell, was not supposed to be spoken from my upbringing.
Exactly right. So this is called the Tetragrammaton, the four-letter name of God, the ineffable name, the name that is not to be pronounced. We're very unusual people in that we at one time may have had knowledge of our God's name. When God is first announcing the divine presence to Moses at the burning bush, Moses asks the question, okay, who are you? Someone's going to say, I am who I am. Hey, yeah, well, that really defines God tremendously, right? So he's going to go to Pharaoh and says, I am sent me. That's going to do a lot. It would appear that that's a problem. So, but it is actually, it's a very thing, and the mystics certainly have a tremendous amount to say about this. However, in ordinary practice, we don't say it. The only one who ever said it was a very specific individual at a very specific time and place. Who was that? Kohen Gadol, otherwise known as, in English? The high priest. When did he recite it?
In the inner sanctuary.
Only on Yom Kippur, once a year, and where? In the most inner sanctum. And there's a tremendous literature around how they made sure he was alert and was okay, and they kept him up, and they prodded him, and they put little bells on his legs and chains to make sure he was okay. I mean, really very, very elaborate. The drama of that is very powerful. And then we forgot how to say it. We don't know the name of our God. I mean, we know it, but we don't know it. So what is the common way in which we recite the name in our ordinary prayer experience? As Adonai. And if you were to see this in other translations that are familiar to you, what would be the most common translation that we would encounter? Lord. Right? And Adon means Lord. So that's not a bad translation, but it's we have even a safeguard around that. We're very big in Judaism with fences around things. And so to even make sure we don't even possibly tread on the substitution for the name of God, we have a substitution for the substitution, which is Hashem, which may have a kind of very, I think it has a lovely sound and feel to it, right? And there's a familiarity about it, and you see people who are really involved in prayer, you will see them very often. This is a gender-specific kind of thing. They will go back and forth and actually say a personal prayer. I've seen this, and it's incredibly moving, I have to say. Hashem this and Hashem that, and then every once in a while they'll pause and they'll say Tati. Tati, which means Daddy, Father. You know, I've seen it's or Tata. I mean, in the Yiddish-speaking world, that's a very powerful thing. So why then? And this is not, again, this is not original to conservative liturgy. It's been in the Reformed liturgy for a long time, and others as well. We have the name appearing as such. That isn't arbitrary. Right? And I can't say for absolute certain why specifically everybody said this is the way to go, but why would you imagine that somebody might say, you know what, we don't want to use the word Lord, we want to use instead Adonai. What might be some of the reasons?
Well, it's a Hebrew, I don't know if it's a Hebrew word or Aramaic, whatever, but anyway, that is probably what was used.
So that's, as a beginning point, you know, not a bad way to pretty seamlessly put a little Hebrew into people's hands, because they probably know the word anyhow, and here it is in English for them to see. What else might be used?
I get the impression that Adonai is much more gender neutral than Lord.
Yes.
I hear Lord, and I immediately do, you know, the Charlton Heston Moses thing, and the David, Michelangelo with the God long beard, and that's not real. But Adonai is more of a spiritual, universal kind of concept.
Right.
Doesn't pertain to any one specific, so that it's a nice ring to it. It's just soft.
Okay, so the sound of it is different, the impression of it is different, okay? So when there are challenges, for example, to moderns, when it comes to prayers or passages or phrases that could be difficult because of our sensibilities, there are a variety of choices that one has, but not an infinite number. Some of the choices involve basically just swallowing it and doing it as it is, right? If you have a Vinu Malkeinu, then you very simply say, Our Father, our King, and you go with it, okay? You can fudge it. You can keep it in Hebrew one way and give it something very, very different in English, which sometimes happens, has happened.
What do you do? What do you say?
Well, you'll get, as an example, arguably somebody might say, well, this is a fudge, because Adonai, well, it's Adonai, it has, technically it's male, but it's not entirely male, and it doesn't really feel that way. In any event, it has that sense of the familiarity of the way in which we address God. So it's removed at least on that level. The translation approach in philosophy that isn't Sim Shalom, our regular Shabbat and daily prayer book, but even more so in this book, was to be idiomatic English with a summary kind of approach to the basic tone of the prayer, but it was not literal. So that you would be far away sometimes from the actual literal meaning of words, and it would soften if it was too difficult or deemed to be too challenging. And Jules Harlow, who was the author of this text that we used up until was applauded and criticized for it. By the way, two very brief funny stories about this book, because we're not going to have much longer, so I think I better leave them with you about this. One is, I don't know if you happen to recall, if you were around at the time, when this book was delivered, which I think was in 1994. Okay? Do you remember how bad?
Yes, the truck.
What was it? There are many delivery companies. What was our luck? What do we have?
Almost, and I can't come up with it, but I know it was hilarious.
Exactly right.
That was it.
The God truck delivered our books. So,
Yes, that's
guaranteed overnight delivery, which gave us a wonderful opportunity to talk about the way God works in the world, and how prayer works. So that was very good. And the other funny story, which I have to leave you with, because again, this may enter the annals of other histories, but not around here very much, is that Rabbi Harlow has a daughter by the name of Elana, wonderful, wonderful person, and she was going into a Lower East Side, at that time, not many left, if any, anymore, but a traditional Jewish bookstore, right? And she was looking for something, and they got into a conversation, and Itzi said to Moishi, I'm talking to somebody here, don't bother me, and then finally she identifies herself, and he doesn't immediately recognize the name Harlow. that highlights it. You might recognize, remember, my father edited this prayer book, the Highland, used in a lot of conservative synagogue. And so the Yitzi yells out, Moishi, the Mahzor's daughter's here. So it's good to be known as something in this world. So
considering this new Mahzor has a lot of Hebrew, it has a lot of English and commentary and whatnot, how did it stay so thin?
Magic.
I think.
No, but I'll tell you one other thing that they did. They did something else. In some respects, they did not duplicate some of the things that actually were duplicates in this book. And in other places, they added more material that was not in this book. Okay? So, and then that together with some of the layout is different. So what we're going to try to do is to keep our service for the time being certainly quite close to what we've done before, so that we can have a feel of continuity. But there will be some things that are going to be on the page in any given place or situation that I think would allow for, oh boy, I never thought of that. Or that's a very interesting way to look about that. And it's a very powerful kind of thing. And so we have.
You know, people are going to be on.
That's what I was thinking.
People are going to be on different pages a lot. We're doing one prayer, and you get so involved with the reading like I do. You're not going to be with the.
Well, I'll tell you, one of the other things.
That's a learning experience.
We strayed from the original question. I began a few minutes ago asking, for whom is this pitched? Right, if you remember.
Yes.
And so the assumption is, I think, that the person who is sitting in Rosh Hashana services is an educated, accomplished person with, like everyone else, a mixture of successes and failures in life, and may find themselves sometimes comfortable and very often not comfortable in a synagogue setting, because they may not have the knowledge of Hebrew and perhaps other prayer experiences. And people, human nature being what it is, are not apt to run into a situation wholeheartedly if they're not so very comfortable with what that is. So let us respect the intelligence and the accomplishments of the people who are with us, and let's find ways of giving them a variety of entry points into this experience as much as possible, which is why, in addition to the commentary throughout the book, there are far more, not entirely, but far more passages that are transliterated. And what I'm looking to try to do is to draw people's attention. Please join us. Here's this page, the transliteration you can find here, so that people will feel that they can join in as much as possible.
And also it's in red, which helps a lot too. All the transliteration is in red.
Yes, and I think that the other thing is, you learn things, and I'm sure that the next editions will think about, just technical things. But one of the things I'm sure that this book never bargained on is eyes that were over 43 years of age. Because eyes that are over 43 years of age cannot easily distinguish between black and purple.
Exactly, yes.
And the purple was for Shabbat, and what happened was a lot of people started finding themselves at a certain point starting to get confused or off a little bit in the text because of the color. So they changed it. That's a live and learn situation.
This feels a lot like the new.
No, go ahead.
A lot like the new. I don't remember the exact title. The new American Haggadah that came out.
Yes.
Commentary.
Yes. The page, the paper. The paper inside there. There's.
Well, the commentary and the poetry and.
Right. And so what I think that we would benefit from is kind of exploring the direction you happen to mention here in a couple of ways. We noted yesterday that there's a history to the development of Jewish prayer, right? We didn't begin as a people with Abraham, and God said to Abraham, leave your father's house, come to the land. By the way, here's the prayer book. Okay. Didn't happen then. And
Revolution, right?
yes, and worship took on multiple forms throughout our history, and we don't get the first prayer books, at least the evidence of them, until the 9th and 10th centuries, maybe 11th century. The Geonim, Amram and Saja Gaon, who lived in Babylonia, they still live there, and their descendants still live there, and we were all visiting. We would be near Baghdad because of the location, right? So, and the service that was there was short. But in addition to that, we mentioned that something very basic happens on virtually every page of a prayer book, which is a different kind of commentary. And we happened to look at Matovu yesterday, the prayers that one recites when one first enters the synagogue. And lo and behold, we discover that the liturgy is a running commentary in most places, not every, but in many places, on passages that have come before, especially biblical passages. And sometimes they are actually expansions of a theme. If I use the term midrash, does that ring a bell? Okay. What would be an example, or let's start with the definition. What is midrash?
It's a story, explaining something.
Okay. Okay, very nice. And what would be an example?
An example.
Yeah, I was up.
Story based on. Story based.
Right. So what is in that case, we'll concretize, if you would, Judy, just the example that Marvin raised before.
Abraham and the story, and his father Terah's idol shop,
Yes, that's a
where
popular
his
one.
father took off
Okay.
and he was left alone and
Story the
broke
idol.
all the idols, and his father comes back and
And-
said, who did this?
Well, the proof was the idol couldn't be worth anything, as he said, the idol killed. He said, how can an idol, Abraham's father said, how can an idol kill? Well, how can you believe that the idol is the God that created the world?
Okay, is that a fairly familiar story to you? Like the Abraham, the iconoclast, breaking the idols in his father's shop. You know what's happening? As we sit here in colleges throughout the United States, there are freshmen, first-year students, who are taking the Bible as literature, or Western civilization, or something like that, in which the book of Genesis is the subject, and they are looking feverishly through the chapters of Genesis, around chapters 11 and 12, 12, 13, 14, going forward. Where's the story of the Bible, of the idol shop? And they're getting very frustrated, and so they're about to call it a night and do whatever they do at 10:30, 11 o'clock at night. But what, which is study more Bible, of course.
Oh, yeah, of course.
So it's not there. So the question is not just, is it a nice story? We like the story. It's a good story. It's not such a good story. It's a pretty well-known story. But why is it told in the first place?
To make
What's the
a
gap?
point, teach a lesson.
And the gap and the point is?
Well, every midrash has its own.
I'm asking your opinion.
No. No, some of the midrashim are beautiful, and they teach you a moral, a story.
A lesson.
It also keeps you interested.
Keeps you
You're
interested.
getting them interested, especially if you're teaching children. When you get a midrash, then you get interested in doing your
And
ritual.
midrash usually deals with something that is pertinent to real life,
Mhm.
and it's personal. So what it does is it takes the concepts that are in the Torah and it converts it into something that says, you think that couldn't happen to you? What if this were to happen to you? Look at this. This is what this really means. This is how we see this in everyday life, which is why midrash can be written constantly, because it is always pertaining to, but the idea is behind it is some halachic value, something from Torah that makes it moral value that needs to be transmitted.
Okay, there's absolute truth to all of that. And I have another question. I'd like to give you an image. Okay, how, it's not the most Jewish one, but it works. How is a pearl formed?
Grains.
The oyster.
An oyster?
The oyster.
In the oyster.
Yeah.
Okay? Okay, so it's an oyster.
I don't know, I don't eat oysters.
And I wear pearls, dear.
In that case, it works. Okay, so, but it is an irritant inside of,
Oh, right.
okay? And over the course of time, right, it grows, it polishes, it has more friction, and it gets more.
It coats it sort of
Coats it.
for build-up, protects it.
But it begins as an irritant. Okay? It's not a bad way to think about how many, and there are different genres, but many midrashim begin. There is an irritant. There is something not quite clear, right. There's something missing.
Yeah.
There can be
It's
other
really
things too,
happening.
but it's missing. So here's the question. We haven't studied it, and it's not fair, I suppose. We really should take all the texts out, but, you know, what is the irritant when it comes to opening up just the Torah? You just finished the story of Noah and the flood, and then all of a sudden, God speaks to Abram at the time, for the name change. Lech lecha me'artzecha, go forth from your land, I'm going to make a great nation out of it. What's missing?
No transition.
There's no transition.
We don't know who Abraham is.
Who's this
Where
guy?
he came from? How did he get to be this such an important figure that Hashem speaks to him?
It's such a big story, you gotta make it more, palatable.
It has to be explained in a way and say, why is this person chosen to become the leader of a great nation that is going to now be the vehicle whereby, after multiple disappointments, God has a new path to try to present fundamental religious and ethical truths to the world. Why Abraham? Right? You can almost hear the Mel Brooks routines in the background being built on this, right? Why? So it has to be a matter of character, but we don't have the information. So a tale, a story, enters into the experience and says, you know what? Here's a man who was, at his earliest time frame, a questioner, a seeker, not afraid to take on his own father in order to say, I have this religious angst in me, and I don't get it. And his father then can teach him because he knows the truth. And interestingly enough, this happens to be a parallel with some historical studies that say that Abraham comes, and his family come from Sumer, right? Very sophisticated culture at the time where writing was invented, but it was missing something. Spicer writes about this in his introduction, which is a scientific text really of Genesis. It's not a religious text per se. And it says, you know what, there's something missing. And then the pieces come together. There are some other textual hints, but the bottom line is, it is the genre of narrative, of storytelling to explain by being pushed by an irritant, I'll use the term, by a stimulus of some kind to create a statement of perceived belief and cherished truth. Okay. That is a fundamental Jewish way. Except for the Middle Ages and various people here and there, the way in which we wanted to offer truths as a vehicle for conveying them was twofold, actually threefold. One was midrash, or stories, right? A second one would be law, right? You don't do Rosh Hashana whenever you feel like it. It happens to be the beginning of the year, and you really should do it next week, okay? And the third is poetry. It's poetry. As opposed to, if you remember, or if you studied and are familiar with, the syllogisms of Socrates and Aristotle and of the Greco-Roman world, that certainly we get a lot of that into the Middle Ages by Maimonides and peers, but this is not the classic earlier time. Why is this important for us? Because this is what Jewish prayer is built on as a form. And where do we find Midrash? All over the place. We have it every week in our service, by the way, as well. Multiple examples, but just as an example from the Shabbat morning liturgy. Yom HaShivi, in other words, that the seventh day is so magnificent that it climbs up and is placed within God's actual throne. And then it's like perched for a dialogue with the divine. It's a personification of Shabbat. I haven't seen Sabbaths climbing around too much lately myself in literal terms, right? It's a statement. And we used an example. Do I have your permission to just refer to it briefly from yesterday?
Go
Okay.
for it.
Just because it's a nice portrayal of it, is a good example, page 34. Okay, so this actually is the very, very first, after the Mincha afternoon service, which ends the old year, the very first thing that our evening service on Sunday is going to have. And there's an old Beth El Temple tradition for this. I'm sure some of you some of you have your hands up with the chicken soup, and I understand that too. So, if you know the melody. But here is something that I think portrays for this that you would not find if you only had Silverman, or any other Mahzor, including this one, that did not have a commentary. In the English at the top of page 34, would somebody just read the first two lines?
Core sections, that's our review.
How lovely, very, very good.
How lovely are
Very good.
You know, there's 2 34s, I'm already.
I'm sorry, I know, 34 left.
How lovely are your dwellings, people of Jacob, your sanctuaries, people of Israel.
Okay, and so the question is, what's this from? What's this from? So let's assume we don't know.
Balak.
I'm sorry?
Isn't it the story of Balak?
Yeah.
And Balaam?
Yeah, it's from a biblical, a Torah text. Okay? Now, if we were not so blessed with someone who knows about this and everything else, would we necessarily know this? No. So we would have recourse now to the commentary, which is on 34 right,
Yeah.
5 up, and then this is how this kind of thing can work. In other words, prayer as a general experience in Judaism is going to be a couple of things. First one is, it is the Jewish historical experience and its production of a set of texts that are a guideline to fundamental Jewish values and beliefs. It's a pretty good textbook to see what does Judaism care about in a pretty succinct form, because this is a lot smaller than the Talmud and the Bible, right? So look at what it says, how low. The first thing is, and you know, it's so obvious in a way that its radicalism is lost potentially. But as Judy indicated, we have a reference. It's from the book of Numbers. Presumably, there might be some people who aren't aware what Numbers refers to, but it's a biblical reference.
Yeah, it makes it all much clearer and brings it to the forefront.
Right.
To now.
Hopefully it does. Would you read on just a little bit right there?
These words were uttered by the Gentile prophet Balaam, who had been hired to curse Israel. They have the distinction of being the only prayer in the classical Siddur attributed to a non-Jew. Balaam's blessing of Israel's dwelling place, together with the verses from Psalms that follow, were seen as appropriate for entering the synagogue, as many rabbinic readings of this verse understood the dwellings of Jacob, literally tents of Jacob, and the sanctuaries of Israel to be houses of study and of worship.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I know for sure it would be possible to construct a semester-long course on this phrase. It possibly could be a year. For here is a couple of questions, right? The setting. The first words traditionally we say when entering a synagogue. And who is the author of those words? A non-Jew. So one of the questions one could ask, if this were a course, for example, in Judaism, viewing the Jew and the other, it could be, what other examples do we have in the Torah where the other is portrayed in a friendly, helpful, and positive way? And we might, for example, talk about Ruth And there's conversion there, so that's already muddying the waters a little bit, right? How about the other who stays the other?
Moses'
Moses'
father?
father-in-law.
Oh, the father-in-law. Great advice. Delegate, right? He's a hero. He teaches some great advice, and he's very, very helpful. Any others?
The people who are, it's not in the Torah, but at Passover, the people who were not Jewish, who accompanied the Jews on the Exodus.
Okay, so it's part of the multitude that leaves. Okay?
But they were
Friends,
through,
we
there's,
talked about
Sure.
Pharaoh's daughter, who saved Moses and brought him home.
Pharaoh's daughter who saves Moses. How about, he's sometimes called Eliezer, but the text in Genesis that talks about Abraham saying to the servant, look, I want you to get me the right wife for my son. Now, on one hand, you have the otherness, right? You can't go anywhere. You have to pick the right background. Right? But the text, it's a long chapter, right? Genesis, it's huge. Portrays this guy as incredibly savvy and really, really on target, and a great reader of human nature, but it never tells us his name. It's as if he is Mr. Anonymous, clearly not Israelite, who's capable of doing a tremendous and very significant deed. And we could multiply this and see it in all sorts of ways. And this already says to us, here's a text, by virtue of having this already, it is one question about Jewish history, Jewish experience, Jewish values that you could sit around and talk about for a long time, because you have them. We did this last time too, but I just want your house, the next one, Getecha. Roberta, just a little more if you wouldn't mind.
sure. The verse refers to the temple. The prophet Ezekiel, comforting the exiles in Babylonia, assures them that God is with them in the small sanctuaries of foreign lands.
Okay, we'll just stop there, okay? The original setting is, in Numbers, what? How beautiful are your tents?
Of Jacob.
Balaam is the prophet saying this. What's he looking at? Encampments.
Yeah.
Okay? Then, we have the setting which is taken by using Beitecha, your house, and the reference tells us it's been transferred from the tents in the wilderness to a focus on the temple in Jerusalem. Wow, that's an interesting shift. Your house. And now, when do we recite this? What is the setting for its recitation? When we first enter the synagogue. That's not a bad encapsulation of Jewish history. From wilderness, temporary living, to centralized worship and centralized living, to exile, to the synagogue becoming a representation of the portability of Judaism when there is no central location. And ostensibly one could make parallels with the home, the Jewish home. So there is a richness and a depth that emerges because there's a commentary. Okay? Now, one of the things that I think is important here, and I want to bring to our attention, is that we have commentary, and we have poetry, and we have then a setting that is unique to High. And this is where it gets complex. Because we could have done this any day of the year, because Matov was there all the time. And in a way, this is easy. But when we get to the high holidays, we are dealing with some pretty serious stuff. And this is one of the things that I think is important, because when we mentioned yesterday that one of the reasons why synagogue services are longer, no one here has ever noticed this, but is longer on Rosh Hashana and Yom Kippur than the rest of the year, has to do with the introduction of what kind of literature? Poetry. And there's a name for that kind of poetry, which is piyut, or piyut. We'll just use the singular for a second. It's a genre. We'll do liturgical poems. We'll just call it. We have lots of liturgical poems. Friday night. What's a liturgical poem from Friday night? That's pretty popular, done everywhere on planet Earth. It's a mystic's paradise, that poem, right? What's another example of a religious or liturgical poem that you know? From any time. Ashrei is from Psalms. So that's poetry. You're absolutely right, that's poetry. But let's,
Miriam's song.
Miriam's song. Also, biblical. Okay, that's a good example. Because I'm really thinking post-biblical, because Lacharodi is 16th century Tzfat in northern Israel, and Kelohenu is probably much older than that, but it's also an acrostic, right, with the letters forming out a message, even though it gets mixed up, which is another story. But that's probably much, much older. Any others that come to mind? Adon Olam, right? Which originally was written for the very, very beginning of one's day, and now becomes popular because it's the end of most services. And Shalom Aleichem, and Yigdal, and all of these, they're poems. They're not meant to be, in all cases, like the statutory parts of the service that we're supposed to recite, like Shema Yisrael, the Amidah, they're poems.
What about the ones that we do at Passover?
Good example. Excellent. What do you have in mind, Andrea? Perfect example. Excellent. And Chad Gadyan, all of those. So we have, God bless our people, a proliferation of this kind of material. And poetry is a certain kind of language. What is the nature of poetry as opposed to, what are some of the things that characterize poetry as opposed to, say, prose?
Concise.
The rhyming.
Well, if you read Homer recently, it's not so concise necessarily. I think. There's
a rhythm to it.
There's rhythm, there's rhyming.
So it's easy to remember. There's a repetition, there's a sound. So that once you get on the flow, it just keeps going. And once you learn it, unlike prose, where it has to be sort of recited and made sense, poetry, you don't even, if you don't know Hebrew, you don't even have to know what the words are. You just sing the Hebrew because it sounds right. It's easy to remember.
It's easy to remember, and I would like to go for another dimension of it.
Has anybody done quote unquote the rap of, Hebrew?
Yes,
poetry?
yes, there is. Well, first of all, rap is very popular in Israel now. And the way Israel, we mentioned this yesterday, what's so interesting is many, many Israelis, modern, secular, agnostic atheists, they will often still use traditional forms in order to make statements. We mentioned yesterday very interesting statements of Al-Chesha Chatan, for the sin we've committed before you, for all sorts of things. They use the form, even though many of the things are, anti-religion sometimes. For the sin we committed before you by not pushing the Haredim to get into the army earlier, for example. But they'll still use the form. Remember Rabbi Goldstein?
Yeah.
She was here. She told, that's a great story. And she was in a Jerusalem television disco visiting once with some friends or whatever. It was during Hanukkah. So at a certain point, they stop the music. The DJ goes down to a table, not near the windows. It goes onto the table. They do a makeshift Chanukiah because it's Hanukkah. Everybody pauses. They light the Hanukkah candles. They say the blessings. They sing Ma'oz Tzor, and then they turn the music back on. It just, that happens. That's one of the interesting things in Israel. But look, poetry is this. It's the difference between saying to someone, I find it congenial to be in your presence because being near you seems to have a positive effect on the secretion of dopamine within my brain and urges the receptors to be particularly efficient. Now, would you like to go to dinner? Right? Versus...
Sounds so like Big Bang Theory.
Yeah, it does. Versus, how do I love thee? Let me count the ways I love thee.
It's also full of metaphor.
Metaphor.
The prose is metaphors.
Okay, so here is what I would like to say. This is really the particular focus of our Shabbat study. Because I want to go into more detail. The poetry of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur is something that conveys a sense of enormous power and enormous depth of emotion on the part of a variety of writers. And there is a voluminous amount of material, and one could think of it as a an anthology almost, what we have here of what is out there, which is much greater. One of the things that we did as an image yesterday, which I will say again, is that, you've heard me tell the story perhaps, and others as well, all religions, to my knowledge, Buddhism may be a little different, have an element of this. There is what we call the pole of humility and the pole of humanity. The stories are abound, right? When King Solomon wanted something that would bring him up a little bit when he was feeling down, he wanted something that would bring him down a little bit if he was feeling a little bit too uppity, as they say. So he had someone carve a ring that had upon it the phrase, Gumzo Yahor, this too shall pass. It's embodied in the story or the statement, one should always have within one's pockets 2 slips of paper, one that says, Bishvili nivra ha'olam, for my sake the world was created, and Isakla Efer, I am just dust and ashes. High Holidays doesn't tend to be overwhelmingly balanced on this. It is much more attuned to, in total, with exceptions. Remember, this is nice and dignified, right? And it's there, but a lot of it is, on which side would you say?
The ashes side.
The darker side, the side of seriousness, of encountering our mortality, of realizing that there is accountability, that we should change. The question is, this is the zillion-dollar question, always, how will people change? What will cause somebody to change direction? And it ranges from today, where we have all sorts of people postulating on, do we have free will, do we not have free will? Is willpower a muscle that is expandable beyond limit, or does it have its limits like any other muscle, right? I'll touch on this in Yom Kippur a little bit because my own fascination with this stuff, but I've come across the marshmallow test more times this past year than in the last 20 years combined. The kids are gathered around the table, right? And put them on. You could have, you wait 20 minutes, you get an extra marshmallow. If you can't, you get one, right? And what causes them to succeed or fail with that? But it's always been the case of trying to see wherein do we have freedom or not, and how do we make our way in the world. And so that's serious stuff. And plus, you take the setting where people will sit, and there's habit, right? So people look around, and they're in pretty much the same places, and they look around and say, you know what? So-and-so used to be there, but I'm not anymore. Maybe because they moved away, or maybe because they don't live anymore. They're not alive anymore. That's sobering stuff. It's not easy. And that's why we mentioned yesterday, it would be nice if we had as many people coming to in their vast numbers on Simchat Torah and Quorum and everything else, because it's a lot more fun. It's a lot lighter. And that's a part of the Jewish experience that's no less important than this. But this is the heavy focus on reflection and self-evaluation and moving towards repairing relationships and regret and atonement. Oh my goodness. It's hard to navigate that, I think, without a guide. But also, to some extent, it's a challenge to be able to deal with it for anybody. And the poetry of the time, much of it is medieval. Medieval ages were not known for their light and sprightly stuff. It was very different. You know, a plague around the corner every other day. It's not so easy. When you have wholesale pogroms defeating Jewish, emptying Jews of their lives, you have expulsions from individual communities, and the absolute cataclysmic experience of the expulsion from Spain, which has its repercussions up until this day, historically speaking. You know, that's not an easy set of circumstances to find oneself in. So that's one of the reasons why the seriousness is so much there. But what I think is the beauty of this book, and I urge you to spend some time looking for this, is that it takes the classic poems, the classic things that are there, and it says, you know what? Let's see a different side. Let's see if we can reinterpret. An example that Ed Feld, who was in town this past week, and gave is he doesn't particularly like one of the PUT called L'chol Ma'amim, and everyone believes. And if you go down a list of what everyone believes, that God is perfect and the Torah is perfect and okay. Well, he said very clearly, not everyone believes. But when you get to that page, you'll read a commentary that says, wait a minute, let's look at this differently. And one of the most intellectually courageous pieces of this book is that it's not afraid to push back a little bit. It's not afraid to say, wait a minute, it doesn't really work this way. And you know why it can do that, by the way? Because Jewish tradition has multiple voices. As I'm fond of saying, if you want the antidote of the theology of Unetana Torah, right, who shall live and who shall die, and that everything is being recorded in this book on high, open up the book of Job. Job wasn't written by Christopher Hitchens 20 years ago, right? It's canonized as sacred, and it has a totally different take on why things happen that way. So this is a part of the tradition, so I think that it is meant to be respected. I don't know if people are going to come away, and this is a question I have, that there's so much here, and there's so many different things that people will say, wait, this is a little because we want people to be able to hold on to something and say, you know, for my heart, this is helpful. But we'll see.
Well, there's so much newness, and it's hard for people to adapt to new. So after a few years of reading, it may be easier for people. The beginning it may be difficult because you're going to be distracted by the midrashim all around it. And then, as I said, you won't be able to keep up maybe, but it's okay because you're still learning, and you're still praying, and you're still doing.
Right.
But
Absolutely.
I see this as being a challenge.
So among the things that I think people will page into this book, hopefully have questions about, I'm giving just a few examples, right? I don't like sovereign, I don't like kings and everything else. What is that all about? Does it help? You don't have to answer this, right?
Yeah.
Does it help to know that maybe the emphasis on so much sovereignty has to do with forming a protest against regimes like Rome and totalitarian regimes all over that chose to put human beings as their deities when there should really be only one deity, and it's not Caesar, and it's not Stalin, and it's not Hitler. So the question would be, does that help? Okay. Besides the obvious gender issues that are employed here because of the nature of the language and the matriarchs that are part of the choices that are offered, this text creates something that is a debate within the gay lesbian community. Because the traditional Torah reading for the afternoon of Yom Kippur is the chapter in Leviticus that deals with Arayot, as it's called, right? A lot of it has to do with incestuous things and with not putting your child to offering as a sacrifice to Moloch, which was part of that. But it's pretty hard to avoid the passages that say, a man shall not lie down with another man. Okay? So the question is, do you censor that in a way or skip it and do an alternative reading that provides one? Or are you better off just reading it, there it is, you deal with it because it's part of the tradition, and you're better off encountering it as opposed to ducking it. Here again, you're one course, right? I mean, these are very, very important kind of considerations. Right? There is the whole Israel versus diaspora dynamic. When we talk about death and we talk about next year and everything else, this has a bit of seriousness to it that is, well, where's the next rocket going to fall? But Americans now join this conversation because after 9/11, we're not exactly 100% so sure that we're not all that secure all the time. Our lives are different. And on the questions emerge. And the bottom line is, the faith that's behind this book, which I think is incredibly important, is that it is possible to live a rich and full and powerful life that is rooted in Jewish tradition with open minds and hearts and an encountering of the richness of the tradition and the willingness to enter into a serious dialogue. That's all.
Another course.
That's all. But it doesn't, I think it assumes, and it's an invitation to activity and not passivity. And you can't do everything in a synagogue service because, it's a certain kind of setting, and you can't start having theological debates whether you like Maimonides or Gersonides better, right? I mean, it just doesn't work too well. But it is the kind of thing that says, when there's a passage quoted in here that says, Martin Buber, very personality, but think about this. Would you ever find this in another book? Martin Buber is quoted in there as saying, I think that the atheist who looks outside the window and sees the beauties of nature may be a more religious being than many Jews who sit in their synagogues. It's in this book. I know a lot of people who are going to agree with that. But it's in this book.
And Martin Luther is a truly religious man.
He is certainly.
But he understands that's, we'll get into that. But as that he is very much the idea of God in a personal relationship. As opposed to some people who feel that the only place that God fits is within the confines of rigorous structure. And there's a real harmony between those two. Both believe, but they believe very differently.
Absolutely. So I'm going to stop with my stuff right now because I don't want to keep you here until Sunday
Can I
night.
just say one thing?
But yes,
I
questions?
think this is a great book because having gone to Rosh Hashana and Yom Kippur and seeing all the people who show up who never show up for Shabbat and never show up for anything else, and they sit there and they don't know what's going on and they're bored, they're going to love this because this has just got so much good stuff to read that I think it will very much involve them in the service in a way that they don't expect. Really
I hope that people feel
So is there a new Siddur coming up?
in 3 years.
Really?
In 3 years.
What's going to happen?
You're gonna have a new Siddur.
No, it's a very interesting thing. I got a call. This came out, I think, 2010. I got a call from a friend who's on the committee. He said, do you want to get the books? I think you'll like them. Special deal. Whole set. So I said, so Larry, what's in the book? So I'll send you a proof. So he sent me like 15 pages in proof form. I said, that's not quite enough to be able to make this decision. It's a lot of money. But what happened was that individuals started buying it when it first came out. A few synagogues started, and it mushroomed very quickly. And so we started to hear very, very fine feedback. And then people used it, even with our service, they just used it as a parallel kind of text and found it to be a very wonderful experience. I think ultimately it will replace this because, every 30, 40 years you probably need a new book because of differences in society. Things change.
And the movement goes along, parallels. Except many of the changes and.
Issues change.
And the issues change too.
Are we donating our old ones to a synagogue, or we're just putting them away?
Well, we're going to keep some, but we're
Working on
donating.
it.
We're working on donating.
Nice.
Synagogues that need.
Oh, yeah. That's a traditional Jewish way of handling
Are any other conservative synagogues in the area using this?
Emmanuel does, Beth El does,
My daughter's synagogue in New York has used it last year.
and they started last year.
I think what's good about this is making people aware of other traditions or other interpretations or of the other.
And we're not stagnant.
Right, and it's, the old book just is one. This is different. And I think that will be, that makes it more of a creative approach, a more active approach to praying and coming to synagogue. And maybe people will like it so much they end up on the rest of the year.
That's good too.
How old is this one?
1975.
Yes.
A couple of things have changed. A couple of things have changed.
I
But
think this is nice because it fills in, it gives you so much explanation that it makes the text really, really, it comes alive, and it gives you that background understanding. Why are we saying this? We always say this, why are we saying this? All of a sudden, guess what, this came from here, this is why this is what this is explained, this is what references back to it, and there's that nice continuity that comes through the text.
I think that's certainly the intent, and I'll leave you with, if I can, a quote from a teacher of mine and somebody who studied with him, Professor Neil Gilman, who's just a very prolific and wonderful teacher of Jewish philosophy. And he used to say that the prayer book is, in Jewish history, is where the pedal meets the metal. You can have all sorts of interesting, flowery essays and books when it comes to explaining theological thoughts and beliefs. But if you're putting it in the form of a prayer, you're really putting it there for everyone to see. And certainly it has to be phrased in a way that has to be succinct and clear and quite declarative. Right? So not only does this book seek to do that with the traditional prayers, which are there for us to encounter, but also in the way it frames its own material so that you can see that the cards are on the table. And you like them, you don't like them, but they're there in increasing form. And that's what I think is very interesting about this. Okay?
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Should we continue?
People are gonna be talking to you a long time after the service.
I hope so.